Good afternoon, class. I'm Dan Putnam, and today I'll be doing a case comparison on two crises during war in American history. First, I'll be looking at the 1968 My Lai massacre during the Vietnam War. Then, I'll look at the 2005 massacre in Haditha during the Iraq War. Though these massacres are eerily similar in conduct and context, the crisis management after these events was different. Through the course of this comparison, I will demonstrate how the American response to the Haditha massacre was significantly better than the American response to the My Lai massacre, despite the similar outcomes of the massacres and the consequences for the perpetrators. First, Vietnam. The Vietnam War started in 1964 with the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. Shortly after, troops poured across the border from the United States, across the Pacific Ocean and into Vietnam, and the conflict quickly grew in intensity. The war was characterized by close and brutal fighting and a type of warfare that breeds extreme violence and stress. It was not long before troops were pushed to the breaking point. In the spring of 1968, an American unit was set to assault the Vietnamese hamlet, where they believed there was a significant stronghold of Viet Cong activity. The company of U.S. Army soldiers landed on the outskirts of a village called My Lai. Over the next couple of hours, an American company of soldiers would slaughter more than 500 innocent Vietnamese women, children, and elderly persons. The violence was unthinkable. It was brutal, unimaginable. And the massacre didn't end until 3 U.S. soldiers, who witnessed the massacre from above in their helicopter, actually landed and stopped the massacre. Because of the nature of the Vietnam War, the My Lai incident was buried in the memories of those who committed and witnessed the massacre for more than 2 years. It wasn't until much later that the massacre came to public attention and actual investigations from the Army came to light. The U.S. government did not manage this crisis very well, and they didn't manage it appropriately. We're behind the power curve on the release of information. First thing I want to address about their crisis management of the My Lai massacre is the leadership at the time. Though President Lyndon Johnson was president during the actual conduct of the massacre, Richard Nixon was president when the massacre actually came to light. Recently found documents from Nixon's White House Chief of Staff indicate that President Nixon was well aware of the massacre before it actually came to public attention. The documents also indicate that Nixon urged a cover-up of the massacre by urging his staff to hide information and discredit witnesses, specifically one witness, Hugh Thompson, who actually was one of those who prevented the massacre from occurring. When the investigations eventually came to light, several soldiers were charged, but only one was actually convicted of a crime. Lieutenant William Cayley, the platoon commander on the ground at the time, was convicted of premeditated murder for his role in the My Lai massacre. However, President Nixon again injected himself into the process and reduced Cayley's sentence significantly. He actually reduced his life sentence to a very short time of house arrest before he was actually released. Nixon's actions to cover up the massacre and protect the perpetrators from justice showed that the administration's priority at the time was absolving America of any guilt or culpability, and instead of actually administering justice and admitting to culpability. This only fanned the flames of dissent amongst the American people. This was the same dissent that actually led to the strategic loss of the war for the United States. Nixon's actions also contributed significantly to the strategic platform that was part of the administration and the U.S. Army at the time. Gray and Martin argued that their platform consisted of 5 tenets: cover up the action, devalue the target, reinterpret the events that occurred, use official channels to give the appearance of justice, and use intimidation. Nixon clearly proved that there was cover-up going on in his effort to kind of suppress the testimony of Hugh Thompson. They actually devalued the targets through their use of common slurs to describe the Vietnamese people, which minimized the actual destruction. They reinterpreted events by really glossing over the events in news stories, and they used official channels to give the appearance of justice through courts-martial, which really proved to be false because of the lack of punishment that was actually administered. As far as communication is concerned, the U.S. Army and the U.S. government proved to consistently be behind the power curve. The reporting of the event actually first occurred from a sergeant who was actually embedded with the company that committed the massacre. He merely reported the event as a successful raid. The next reporting didn't come until the fall of 1969, when the Army announced the charges against Lieutenant Cayley. But they didn't mention that his charges were for the role in a massacre. That didn't really come to light until December of that year, 1969, when images of the results of the massacre were broadcast on national television on the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite. The response to My Lai was really characterized by poor leadership, an insidious platform of denial and cover-up, and a systematic silence from the U.S. government. These are all poor crisis management techniques, and really meant that the U.S. government and the U.S. Army were reacting to information as it was released and trying to hide things instead of proactively releasing information. This resulted in a massacre that is now remembered to this day as a disaster for the U.S. Army and really has come to characterize the legacy of the Vietnam War. Fast forward now approximately 35 years, and the U.S. is invading Iraq. It's 2003, and Saddam Hussein has been publicly said to have had weapons of mass destruction. Like the Vietnam War, the war in Iraq escalated quickly, and the battles became intense against an insurgent population. Similarly, there was an introduction of improvised explosive devices, which caused a massive amount of casualties on the U.S. side. In late 2005, the Marines of 3rd Battalion, 1st Marine Regiment were engaged in heavy fighting in the Haditha region of Iraq. Now, on November 19th, a squad of Marines on patrol were struck by an IED, killing one of the Marines. In the approximate 20 minutes following the IED blast, the squad of Marines killed 24 unarmed Iraqi civilians, some of them women and children. As we will see, the resulting reaction and response to this crisis was significantly different. First, the leadership which should be addressed. Lieutenant Colonel Jeffrey Chesani, the commanding officer of the battalion who had a squad that committed the massacre, he was actually charged with crimes, one for violating a lawful order and 2 counts of dereliction of duty, because he failed to appropriately report the massacre to higher authorities. However, unlike My Lai, this is where any hint of a cover-up seems to end. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Peter Pace, all publicly acknowledged the killings as soon as they learned of them. In fact, President Bush, who learned of the massacre a few months later, actually said in a press conference he was troubled by the initial news stories and was mindful that a thorough investigation needed to be conducted, and also promised that if in fact laws were broken, that punishment would be administered. General Hagee, the commandant of the Marine Corps at the time, actually flew to Iraq after learning of the killings to actually address all of the Marines who were fighting the war. He impressed upon them the importance of protecting innocent civilian life in Iraq and adhering to the laws of armed conflict. It appeared that leadership at all levels, above that of Lieutenant Colonel Chesani, really appropriately addressed the massacre and acknowledged the killings and addressed the troops to ensure that this kind of event wouldn't happen again. And it was a significant improvement over how the administration responded to the My Lai massacre. The platform of the U.S. response to the Haditha massacre was one of investigations. Investigations were really promised in large, and they did occur. Multiple general officers from multiple branches of the military and multiple branches of the government actually conducted investigations into the massacre. All of them found that some misconduct had been committed on part of the Marines and recommended that charges be filed against them. In all, 8 Marines were charged as a result of the investigations. However, this is where there seems to be a departure from President Bush's earlier promise of punishment. Of the 8 Marines charged, only 1 was convicted of a crime. The other 7 had their charges dropped. Staff Sergeant Frank Woodrich, the one who was actually convicted, actually pled guilty to dereliction of duty and received 90 days in the brig, a reduction of rank and private. This was the only punishment for the deaths of 24 innocent civilians at the hands of U.S. Marines. It should also be noted that Staff Sergeant Woodrich's punishment wasn't actually handed down until 2012, 7 years after the massacre occurred, well after the Haditha massacre had faded from public conscious. Now, the first reporting of the Haditha massacre came in March 2006, 4 months after the massacre occurred. This is likely due to Lieutenant Colonel Chessani's cover-up of the event. However, as soon as the administration learned of the massacre, they did report it widely. In fact, the U.S. government took a very proactive approach to releasing information to the media at the time. This meant that the U.S. military and the government had almost complete control over the narrative and release of information about the massacre. In fact, the Commandant of the Marine Corps issued an instruction that any press questions about the Haditha massacre should be directed to Headquarters Marine Corps, thus ensuring a homogeneous and controlled narrative about the massacre. This was significant in helping reduce the public outrage because the American government appeared to be somewhat transparent about the massacre. Both these massacres were similar in conduct and context. However, the resulting crisis was handled quite differently by both administrations. The My Lai massacre was characterized by government denial, cover-up, and a lack of justice. Conversely, the Haditha massacre was characterized by a public acknowledgement, a controlled release of information, and widespread investigations and a government response. Though the judicial outcomes of the two massacres were quite similar, the My Lai massacre is much more well known to this day, despite the Haditha massacre occurring much more recently in American history. This is likely due to the much better response to the Haditha massacre than the My Lai massacre. The My Lai massacre is still largely regarded as a scar on American public conscience, one that could have been significantly reduced if the crisis was managed better by the military and the government at the time. I'll close with a quote from Lawrence Colburn, one of the soldiers who tried to prevent the massacre in My Lai. He said in the mid-2000s, after the war in Iraq had gone on for several years, quote, "It makes me wonder about 46 years of testimony, of interviews, books, and lectures. I know it's had some impact, but on a large scale, does it really matter what we say? I think the responses to these two crises really does show that what we say does matter. The U.S. response to Haditha was much more open and transparent, and this really helped to minimize the negative impacts of the massacre. Conversely, the poor communication of the My Lai massacre really meant that that massacre has festered and has remained in public conscience much longer than it could have had it been communicated better by the administration at the time." Thank you.